Hello, everybody. My name is Valentin Werner, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the International Society for the Linguistics of English to this expert forum on studying telecinematic language. Would like to share a nice quote with you by Alistair Pennycook that I came across. And he says, good research in popular culture may look to some like hanging out in interesting places, but at some point, the hard work on texts, interactions, lyrics, images, and languages has to be done. And it's my conviction that our three panelists today have taken this or something like this very much to their hearts. So let me briefly introduce them to you before we go to their presentations. So I would like to start with Robin Queen. Robin is professor of linguistics at the University of Michigan with various appointments and affiliations in other departments. For instance, since 2022, she has been chair of the Department of Communication and Media there. She's a former co-editor of the Journal of English Linguistics and author of the widely cited 2015 book, Vox Popular, The Surprising Life of Language in the Media. And in this publication, she very much succeeds in connecting the topics of language variation and media linguistics. And among other things, she discusses the relevance of some central notions from sociolinguistics. So for instance, indexicality and registerment, audience design, and so on in the context of telecinematic language. Our second panelist is Christian Hoffmann. Christian is senior lecturer in English linguistics at the University of Augsburg in Germany, where he also serves as the program coordinator for the Master in English and American Studies. He's a member of the editorial boards of Internet Pragmatics and the Journal of Language and Pop Culture. And while he's well known for his 2020 volume Telecinematic Stylistics, co-edited with Monika Ludwig, together with Christina Sanchez-Stockhammer, he has recently guest-edited an open access special issue of the journal Anglistik on verbal and multimodal characterization in film. And last but not least, Monika Bednarek has joined us. She's full professor of linguistics at the University of Sydney, where she also directs the Sydney Corpus Lab. And among other databases and resources, this lab provides access to the Sydney corpus of television dialogue, for instance. Also, together with Raffaele Zago, she curates the comprehensive bibliography of linguistic research on fictional television series and films, on movies, which is really an important resource for all linguists engaging with telecinematic language. As you all probably already know, she has published widely on telecinematic discourse, so I just want to mention her 2010 book, The Language of Fictional Television, and the 2018 volume, Language and Television Series, A Linguistic Approach to TV Dialogue. It's further worth noting that her most recent book publication, which you can see on the screen, won the monograph prize by the Screenwriting Research Network in 2023. So this is also some of her accolades. And yeah, I'm really, really happy that we have this high profile panel here. And that said, I would like to hand over to Robin for the first presentation.
Hi, everyone. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm delighted to be a part of this panel. It was so exciting to be invited and to see it getting set up. I wanted to just start with a brief, I guess, excursion into my own history. I started working on telecinematic language or language in the mass media almost as soon as I started graduate school. My first publication in 1996 was a paper discussing sort of orthographic and linguistic variation in the comic book Hothead Paisan, Homicidal Lesbian Terrorist. And one of the things I was really interested in was how the creator, Diane Damasa, was able to use variation in orthography and some linguistic elements to highlight both generalized sort of, we might say stereotypes or at least recognizable types of lesbians and the very specific lesbian characters that occurred in her zine. In other words, she was using stylized language to create specific identities that were both general and specific. And you can see a few of the things she was doing here. She's representing an in versus ing pronunciation. She's using a kind of newish lexical item that she created, spritz, to characterize roughly sort of roughly heterosexual women. And then she used boldface to capture hothead herself, which is reflected then as well in the various drawings. So this is just one quick example of something that drew my attention. So I got really interested in how it is that language, especially stylized language, could offer insights into various aspects of linguistic identity and sociolinguistic theory more broadly. So, in thinking about this question, Valentin asked us to think about why should telecinematic discourse be the focus of serious scholarship. And I mean, at one level, one answer to that question is why shouldn't it be? So I think one of the things that I've been quite interested in for some time is in what sense is telecinematic discourse, sort of not the subject of any number of kinds of linguistic and especially sociolinguistic study. So I think for linguistics, there's sort of two basic questions around this type of language. One is telecinematic language real language? And so there's a couple of interesting ways to think about it. So on the one hand, it isn't real in the sense that it is occurring out in the wild. It's highly scripted, and yet it's also created by real human beings. And even if you want to verge into, well, it's starting to be created by artificial intelligence, that's still largely motivated from an underlying human created set of data. So real humans create it, and especially if it's spoken or signed video, humans actually produce it. So human bodies, human vocal tracks. So in that sense, it's clearly real. The other thing about it, and I think this was shown most directly in Sally Monty and Craig Roberts' 2005 paper on intensifiers in this television series Friends, where they showed that the relative proportions of different intensifiers and the relationship of intensifiers frequencies to sort of socio-demographic categories like gender, pretty much mapped directly or correlated directly with what you see in studies of intensifiers in the real world. So they were able to show that the intensifier so was sort of coming into being, was changing and taking over, becoming the more popular intensifier relative to really. I was also able to show that if you look at, I looked uh, at the television show do the right thing, and was able to show that two characters who were basically the same type of character, so they had this pretty much the shared demographics, but they varied in terms of their use of kind of canonical features of African American English, including copula deletion, and especially in versus ing usage, so that the character that was more tied to the urban setting in which they lived used more in, and the character that was more sort of um, outwardly oriented used more ing. So there are ways in which it sort of gives us insight into uh, the kinds of patterns that we see in the real world. And I think it also illustrates interesting and changing cultural norms. So you can see this, and Monika has also written about these issues with respect to taboo language. So the way in which taboo language over time occurs in the telecinematic media has changed largely in line with the way it's changed kind of out in the non-telecinematic world. So I want to give you one additional quick example showing how this kind of real world relationship can play itself out in the media, and to give you a sense especially of how telecinematic discourse draws on not only the sort of actual patterns in the real world, but especially the ideologies around real world language use. So this is from the film Mickey Blue Eyes, which is a gangster comedy roughly. And in this scene, you're seeing where the character played by Hugh Grant has to pretend to be a member of the mafia.
Hey, forget about it.
Hey, forget about it.
Forget about it. Forget no R's.
Forget about it.
And now change the T's to D's.
Hey, forget about it.
Id?
Well, you said change the T's to the D's, for Christ's sake.
Not the last one.
What? All right, change the T's to the D's, but not the last one.
Forget about it. Stop. Try this one here. Get the hell out of here. No R's.
Get the hell out of here.
Not he. Here.
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 Okay, so with that, you can see the ways in which these kind of very canonical, very stereotypical tropes, forget about it, get out of here, get the hell out of here, are being rendered for sort of another layer of stylization. So you have the actual stylization that it occurs in any telecinematic discourse, and here you have the next level of performativity or stylization in which one character tries to teach another character some of these various tropes and has their own way of describing it. So you notice he says nothing about any of the vowels or anything like that. He's very focused on the consonants and the R's and the T's and the D's. So this reveals some of the ways in which telecinematic discourse is actually real and represents real language. The second question, I think, and this is, and I should say, these are also the ways in which the study of telecinematic discourse gives us insights into language and language use more generally. So the one question is whether language is real. I think the other question that linguists raise is whether telecinematic discourse is naturally occurring. So this is one of the primary foci of especially variationist sociolinguistics. So it's a sort of open question whether the highly scripted nature of most telecinematic discourse renders it somehow not really natural. And I think you can answer that in the same way that you can answer the question of real, but even more specifically, in a way, you can think of the scripted telecinematic discourse as an actual feature, as an actual benefit of studying telecinematic discourse, precisely because it is so highly stylized. And because it is so highly stylized, you get a very clear and fairly transparent view into the cultural values and the linguistic value, the linguistic values of a given cultural moment in time and space. So you can tell that this film clip that I just showed was from 1999, and many of the telecinematic discourses that we look at and the language that we look at is stamped for its place in time and space. One of the reasons that the highly stylized nature is so important is because the telecinematic discourse has to use language that is highly recognizable and highly salient and fast for its audience. They have to be able to recognize it. And so if you can use the stylized nature of telecinematic discourse to answer important theoretical questions around indexicalities, around ideologies, around persona, around stereotype, the telecinematic discourse or telecinematic language offers a really great way to engage some of those questions. And I'll just end with saying, in addition to the sort of theoretical importance that it can have, it's also a brilliant way to teach people about sociolinguistic variation, precisely because it is so stylized. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christian. Thanks.
All right, thanks a lot, Robin. And yeah, Christian, if you could start sharing your screen and take it from there.
Okay, so can it, let me just quickly open this up and then, okay, can everyone see that? Is that okay? Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Is that okay?
Yes, it's
Okay, excellent. I was going, okay. All right, so hopefully I won't repeat too much of what Robin has already told us. What I'm going to do for the next 10 minutes, or what Valentin has asked me to do, is to do the same Robin did, but this time from the vantage point or from the perspective of pragmatic research and telesematic discourse. But again, I will sort of start with the same question: why should the linguistic study of telecinematic language be considered as a serious scholarly endeavor? And I want to start by saying that maybe today this is not such an important question as it was maybe 10 to 15 years ago, when the investigation, or at least the linguistic investigation of pop culture and telesematic language, was somewhat more novel and out of the ordinary. I think there's so much research nowadays in telesematic language in so many different fields of language studies that it has become a commonplace to study that. So that's a good thing I think we should remember. Also, I want to stress that, of course, fictional data in general, but telecinematic language in particular is, of course, a particularly rich source for not only linguistic, but particularly also for pragmatic theorizing and for linguistic research in general. And if you think of it, I mean, if you teach in a country where English is not the native language of speakers, turning to television, movies, and telesematic language in general is a very rich and accessible source that you can tap into and that your students can tap into in order to work on linguistic projects. So that's a good thing. Also, I think we need to keep in mind that it's, of course, very difficult to disentangle fictional from non-fictional data. If you look at television shows, for instance, some of them are extremely scripted, some of them are not. It's very difficult nowadays to really determine the level of scriptedness and prefabrication in the language that you can see. And because there are so many fuzzy boundaries, I think we should absolutely include it. Or as Robin said, why should we not study that kind of language? In fact, there are linguistic fields which have always studied fictional language data, is stylistics, for instance, has, but also historical linguistics. Another thing that Monika Bednarek has pointed out or hinted at in multiple publications of hers is, of course, the social and psychological impact on popular culture in general, of which telecinematic discourse is a huge part. And we know from mass media communication studies that there is, of course, an interrelationship between the people that regularly watch television shows and, for instance, the kind of language that they adapt, and at the same time, the feedback that gets streamed into the new seasons of a television show, where the writing room takes up some of the comments or demands of the fans and tries to include them and also maybe tailor the language that they use to their target audience. So there's an interesting interrelationship that needs to be discussed. Also, I think there, as Robin has just shown, language in television shows and also in film are important reference points and raise awareness to language ideologies and cultural ideologies, different moments in time. If you want to do a critical discourse analysis, a critical pragmatic study, movies and television shows are very interesting points of departure. They're also a hub for intercultural, intermediate, and intertextual research. So it's interesting and relevant, I think, to look at how, for instance, a book, a comic book, a graphic novel has been transposed onto the silver screen, or the different kinds of television series that treat the material differently, and to take an inside look at how they do that, how they stage it, and for what kind of narrative purposes the language is adapted. And finally, I think that kind of research also has a lot of applied research purposes and purposes for, for instance, the film trade, for screenwriters who might be interested in finding out more systematic, empirical, or data-driven results of how language is used in different television genres, so for different characterization purposes. And of course, it's also interesting for the pragmatics in translation. How do you translate, the film dialogues? To what extent? What you need to watch out for? What are the pitfalls? Now, in terms of pragmatics, how pragmatics has benefited from the analysis, and maybe also how pragmatics has contributed to the study of telesematic language, I just want to point out that Cambridge element that recently came out by Loche et al., who actually treat this kind of question quite extensively and break this down on different levels. There's separate chapters just for telecinematic language. So if you're interested in that question, I highly recommend it. Now, based on the research areas that they draw out in the book, I basically condensed that to 3 main areas: participation, multimodality and interaction, and identity and rapport management. I quickly go through them one by one. Now, in terms of participation, we know participation frameworks from pragmatic research outside of telesematic language research. And we know, of course, that this is important, that meanings are not just negotiated and supplied from one person to the next. Then there's one person that constructs the message, another one that receives it. But of course, it's much more complex than that. And we have known that for quite some time. We've known that in sociolinguistics through, audience design, Bell's studies on audience design, or, Hoffmann studies on participation framework. I think what telesematic research has contributed is to move participation frameworks into the fictional realm and to, first of all, point out, of course, that there's double articulation in movies and television shows. You have the story level where characters talk to each other, and on the other hand, you have the team of creators that try to convey information and meanings to the audience. And so it has basically led to more complex models and configuration schemes of how communication takes place and what the configurations of that are. And one of the interesting things, if you play around with those participation formats, is that you will see that they tend to differ, and the setups tend to be different from one television genre to the next. There are interesting studies, for instance, by Alexander Brock, that showed that the different participation framework has an impact on how different comedy shows realize their goals, how humor is created, how suspense is created, and so on. And I think maybe future research will also look at how participation frameworks can be applied to other television and movie formats for narrative purposes, different narrative purposes. In terms of action, interaction, and multimodality, from a pragmatic point of view, there have been some very interesting studies on how characters in television shows and in movies use speech acts, what kind of elocutions they've used, to what kind of frequency, and how they're dispersed across different characters, and also how they're realized. So maybe in contrast, or by comparison to, of course, a lot of speech act studies in naturally occurring talk, it might be interesting to see and compare if the speech acts, the elocutions are used in particular ways in different television genres, but also in movies to serve particular purposes, particularly concerning characterization of them. Then, of course, there have been a lot of studies on implicatures, looked at crisis implicature theory and even relevance theory. The idea is, and that's, I think, an extension from telesematic research, that this does not only occur on the verbal realm, but we have actually cinematographic means and we have visual means in movies that can trigger implicatures and lead to relevant and interesting narrative effects, such as the creation of suspense, the characterization of individual characters, the foregrounding of certain mind styles of individuals. There's also interesting work on film discourse interpretation, on film discourse cohesion and coherence, how argumentative structures can be worked out between different scenes of a movie, and how language plays a role in binding movie scenes or stages together. And finally, what I also find interesting is that recently more and more people using CA have keyed into films and television shows, trying to draw out how talk is different in movies and television shows, in contrast to naturally occurring conversations. And it turns out that in a lot of different types of talk in movies have different conventional baselines that tend to differ from everyday contexts. And I think it's important to study and explore these baselines in order to determine when screenwriters, for instance, deviate from those baselines of a conversational organization. And it therefore allows us to pinpoint these deviations much more clearly and to identify why they do it for different narrative effects or dramaturgical purposes. There's also been an attempt to expand that to the multimodal level, which then includes gestures, mimics, and gaze as well. And then finally, my final point, identity and rapport management. There's extensive work on impoliteness and politeness, how that applies to different television shows and movies as well. There are some interesting studies on relational work with fans of television shows, how they interact on social media channels, for instance, how they use the television shows to create mutual identities and negotiate their relational, the interpersonal dimension. Also, there's, of course, an interesting work on expressive and emotional stances by different fictional characters, how they're shared by the characters in television shows, but also how particular characters tend to be different, and through their difference then maybe establish particular traits. I think this is an area that has a clear overlap with what Robin has already mentioned in stylistics and sociolinguistics, to be sure. And I think there are some very interesting critical discourse studies that key in with this particular type of analysis that allows us to identify, for instance, how gender is represented, how different ethnic groups are represented on the screen, how different cultural and political identities come to the fore. And as Robin said, at different points in time, and that allows us to then take a critical stance on how these realities are presented and which belief systems are portrayed through movies and television shows. Okay, thank you very much. And I hand over to Monika now.
All right, thanks a lot, Christian. And yeah, we go straight to Monika.
Okay. All right. Let me just set up my screen here. Okay, right. Okay, so yeah, I just also want to thank Valentin for inviting me to be a part of the panel, and of course for hosting the panel. And I'm also going to address the 3 points that we've been asked to address. I might do it maybe a little bit quickly because some of the things that I'm going to say have already been mentioned, but I'll try to make some connections to the previous speakers. So looking at that first question about why should we take telesematic language seriously, I mean, I agree with Christian that maybe it's not as important a question now as it was earlier on, but I think it depends on who you're talking to, the audience you're talking to. So, however, in my early book, I really felt, and when I wrote about this in 2010, I really had quite an extensive discussion on this. And I just want to maybe rehearse some of the issues here. One of the reasons why I started to look at telecinematic language and television series in particular was really actually to do with developments in the television industry, where people were starting to talk about the golden age of television, where you had television series that were suddenly really sophisticated in terms of aesthetics. Some people were saying that they had literary qualities. People in literary studies were even starting to analyze them. So that was sort of one area in which one can go, is sort of looking at these kind of more literary narratives. But I've always thought that, yes, that's certainly an argument, but I don't think we should dismiss the kinds of series that are maybe not literary, that don't have those literary qualities, because they're also incredibly popular. In fact, sometimes the series that are more literary are maybe not even as popular as other shows. And so Christian's talked about this, just by sheer virtue of this popularity, of course, they can have a lot of influence. They can have cultural impact on societies and cultures. And people also engage with the characters that they encounter, both on a psychological level and also on a discursive level. What I mean by that is, for example, research in media psychology has shown this for a long time, that people actually form parasocial relationships with the kinds of characters that they encounter. And from a linguistic perspective, we can see lots of discourses by audience members that respond to what they encounter, whether it's fans on social media or in their own fan discourses, but also critics and many others. For example, I think Robin has also shown that people can talk about the way accents or dialects are represented, and talk back. And Bleichenbacher as well has looked at how people talk back at representations of multilingualism on, for example, forums. Also, because we're looking here at English language, of course, many of the series that we're looking at are maybe from the US or from Britain, and we know that they've been widely syndicated worldwide. And so we do have this transnational or global engagement. And in some cases, the language that people encounter has become a model for learners of English as a foreign language. Robin has talked about this to some extent, looking at it from a social linguistic point of view. We can look at how television series or telecinematic language contributes to the dissemination of representations, ideologies. Also, Christian mentioned that with respect to critical discourse analysis. That includes, of course, ideologies and attitudes about language itself, such as standard language ideology, as Lippy Green pointed out when she looked at Disney movies and how language is used there in terms of who uses what kind of language variety, the heroes and the villains and the kind of stereotypes that we have there. Valentin, I think, mentioned earlier this idea of enregisterment. So we can also look at how does telecinematic language contribute to enregistering particular linguistic repertoires, tying particular linguistic features to indexical meanings, to identity, to creating these kinds of varieties in the public domain for us that we can then draw on for our own stylistic purposes, for example, in parody or performance. And then also I'm interested as well in the humans that Robin mentioned, the humans behind this creation. So screen creatives, looking at telecinematic language itself can also inform us about their language awareness and their kinds of models that they have of, say, language variation, as well as also their language ideology. So just kind of summing up, I would say that looking at telecinematic language, it can inform us about language use itself. Of course, it can also tell us about storytelling, what's happening in this kind of, say, serial format, if we're looking at television. But it also can tell us about the societies that we live in. We can then, of course, even if we're doing that from a synchronic point of view, we can use this as a baseline. This is what's happening right now. And, 20 years later, we could do the same study. We could see, what has changed, what has stayed the same. Of course, we can also go back in time. And Valentin, for example, has done some diachronic studies on, say, swear and taboo words. Now, going to the second point, how has corpus stylistics, corpus linguistics benefited from the analysis of telecinematic language? I mean, on the one hand, I would say we've benefited because we now have better insights into the linguistic characteristics of telecinematic dialogue. What does it even look like? And I'll talk more about that in a second. Beyond that, I think, it has actually resulted in the development of novel concepts or the adaptation of existing frameworks. So, for example, in my own work, I've looked at processes of recirculation. So how does language that we encounter in the television dialogue then become recirculated outside that original context? Looking at this idea of expressive character identity. So, what is the role of emotions and values, attitudes and ideologies for really establishing the characters that we engage with? Then, because we're dealing with a particular media context, especially in the US with censorship, what does that mean for how people are creative with how they use swear and taboo words? So looking at establishing a taxonomy of the different options that we can encounter. And then, of course, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is drawing on Sarah Kozlov's work from film studies and looking at the stylistic functions of television dialogue, in particular in this kinds of serial environment. And I think it has the potential to then feed back into stylistic analyses of other kinds of either dramatic texts or performance texts as well. And so, looking at a different kind of context can actually maybe make us reevaluate some traditional contexts as well. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about these other points here, but other linguists have also developed and adapted theories or frameworks. And in fact, Christian has talked a lot about these, especially in pragmatics, looking at the participation framework, how that interacts with characterization, how it interacts with humor, impoliteness, and also character manipulation. I'm thinking here of the work by Sorlin on House of Cards. So sometimes, this was quite interesting because we have manipulation built into that narrative, and it allows us to actually look at that. How is that being represented? So I would say that it already has had a theoretical impact on various fields in linguistics, and I hope that also contributes to informing us about the value of studying this. But beyond that, I would say, looking at corpus linguistics, or just linguistics more generally, because I think it's a bit difficult to kind of separate. I think looking at television series has overall encouraged mixed method and interdisciplinary approaches. So maybe it helps a little bit to break up some of the disciplinary silos. Obviously, it's contributed to the emergence of the linguistics of pop culture, which you're all aware of with, Valentin's and colleagues' new journal as well here. I think it has widened the scope of media linguistics, because it used to be for a long time that media linguistics was mainly about the analysis of news discourse, and I think has widened the scope of media linguistics to look at also telecinematic language and other types of media. And the final point I guess I want to make here is that there has been increasing interest in multimodal corpus-assisted discourse analysis, developing multimodal corpora, integrating visuals. There's also been an increased interest in triangulation in corpus linguistics. I would say that it's a little bit unclear whether these interests are really directly a result of the corpus linguistic study of television discourse. It's probably more likely a confluence of different factors. But in my own case, I certainly first got interested in multimodality through my work on media, both news and television as well. And so I think it's definitely contributed to that, but it's, I'm sure, not the only factor. Now, so very finally, what are some crucial insights that a corpus linguistic study of telecinematic language has given us? I would say it has shown the kind of different stylistic functions that television dialogue or telecinematic dialogue fulfills as they relate to the narrative and target audience. If we look at the participation framework, corpus linguistic studies, I think, suggest that television dialogue is both similar and different to spontaneous speech. This is also something that both Christian and Robin mentioned. Robin with respect to the intensifiers, where we have these similarities. Christian also with respect to conversational structure and other issues where we have differences. So, looking, I think there's probably, I would say, more or less a consensus that it's a selective imitation. And we can look at similarities. Where are the similarities? There are lexicogrammatical similarities, but then also where are the differences, whether it's over and underuse of features or conversational structure or other stylized language use and things like that. And then I guess the final point, that television dialogue in particular is very innovative and contains non-codified language more than maybe other narrative mass media do. And so I will leave it at that.